Villisca, Iowa, a quiet farming town in 1912. Fewer than 3,000 people lived there. Neighbors knew each other by name. Doors weren't locked at night. It was the kind of place where kids ran barefoot down dirt roads, and the most exciting event of the year was the Sunday church service or the traveling preacher passing through. But on June 9, 1912, this peaceful town turned into a nightmare that has never been solved. The day began with the Moore family. Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. Josiah was a respected businessman, known for his hardware store and his devotion to his church. Sarah, his wife, was just as respected, active in the Presbyterian community and admired for her warm motherly spirit. That Sunday was special. Their church was hosting a Children's Day service. Sarah had been planning it for weeks, and the whole Moore family was there. After the service, the family invited 2 young girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, to spend the night at their house. The Stillinger sisters were friends of Catherine Moore, and their parents agreed. It was supposed to be an innocent sleepover. That night, 8 people went to bed inside the Moore home. By sunrise, all of them would be dead. The killer entered sometime after midnight. No one knows exactly how. Some say he slipped through the back door, which might have been left unlocked. Others believe he had been hiding inside the house all day, waiting for darkness to fall. What is certain is that the weapon he carried was Josiah Moore's own axe, and with it, he committed one of the most brutal murders in American history. The details are almost too disturbing to believe. Each victim had been bludgeoned in the head, most beyond recognition. Some were attacked so violently that the axe gouged deep into the ceilings from the force of the swings. Every member of the Moore family was killed in their beds. The 2 Stillinger girls, sleeping downstairs, were also murdered. But here is where it gets stranger. The killer didn't leave right away. He stayed inside the house for hours, maybe the whole night. He covered the mirrors and windows with cloths. He placed clothing over the victims' faces. He even cooked himself food in the Moore kitchen, though he never ate it. Some say he washed his hands in a bowl of water, leaving behind a bloody basin. It wasn't just murder. It was ritual. The next morning, neighbors noticed the house was unusually quiet. No one had been seen starting chores, and the Moore children hadn't come outside to play. Mary Peckham, the neighbor, grew concerned. By 8 a.m., she called Josiah's brother, who came to check the house. What he found inside scarred the town of Villisca forever. 8 bodies, a family destroyed, 2 innocent guests slaughtered, and not a single clue that pointed clearly to the killer. Word spread fast. In a small town like Villisca, everyone knew within hours. The house was soon surrounded by townsfolk, all desperate to understand what had happened. Some even wandered inside, contaminating the crime scene before the sheriff could lock it down. By then, footprints were trampled, evidence was moved, and the case was already compromised. Yet, even with a ruined crime scene, certain chilling details emerged. The killer had used the blunt end of the axe for most of the murders. Josiah was struck with such force that his face was completely destroyed, his skull split open. His wife Sarah's head had been crushed. The children were all attacked in their beds, never given a chance to fight back. Downstairs, Lena Stillinger's body showed signs that she may have woken up. Her position suggested she struggled. Some reports even claim she was sexually assaulted, though this has never been fully proven. The horror didn't stop with the murders themselves. The killer seemed to take his time, almost staging the house in ways no one could explain. Each mirror was covered. Each victim had their face hidden. And outside, in the barn, investigators found strange marks, suggesting someone had sat there, watching the house, before going inside. The town was shaken to its core. How could something like this happen in Villisca? Who could have done it? Theories began immediately. Some suspected a traveling stranger. Others believed it had to be someone in town. After all, the killer seemed to know the layout of the house. He seemed comfortable enough to linger after the murders, confident he wouldn't be caught. The investigation stretched on, pulling in suspects from all over: ministers, businessmen, drifters, theories of cult killings, tales of jealousy, revenge or madness. But none of it ever led to a conviction. To this day, the Villisca Axe Murders remain unsolved, and the house where it happened still stands. Many say it's haunted. Visitors report strange sounds, footsteps, even voices. Some believe the spirits of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls are trapped inside, reliving that night over and over again. But whether you believe in ghosts or not, the story itself is enough to haunt anyone. 8 lives ended violently, a town scarred for generations, and a killer who vanished into the night, never to be caught. That's Villisca. That's the nightmare of 1912, and that's why, over a century later, people still whisper about the night the Moore family went to bed and never woke up. When Sheriff Hank Horton arrived at the Moore house, he had no idea what he was walking into. He stepped into the kitchen first. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The shades were drawn, the air felt heavy, and an odd smell hung in the rooms. He moved into the parlor, then the bedrooms. What he saw was worse than anything he had experienced in his career. The sight of Josiah Moore's shattered skull, Sarah's face hidden beneath a cloth, the 4 more children lying lifeless in their beds, and then downstairs, the Stillinger sisters, also gone. 8 bodies, every one of them bludgeoned. Sheriff Horton staggered outside, pale and shaken. Within hours, dozens of townsfolk crowded around the house. The police tried to hold them back, but word spread fast in a small town like Villisca. By mid-morning, hundreds of people gathered at the Moore residence, whispering, speculating, terrified. Some even slipped past authorities and walked inside, trampling through the crime scene, staring at the carnage with morbid curiosity. The damage to potential evidence was irreparable, but as messy as the investigation was, a few things stood out. The killer had covered every mirror and reflective surface in the house. Some believed this was a ritualistic act, tied to superstition, that covering mirrors prevented spirits from being trapped. Others saw it as a sign of guilt. Maybe the murderer couldn't stand to see his own reflection after what he'd done. The victims' faces had all been covered too, as if the killer couldn't bear to look at them. Josiah and Sarah were struck the most violently. Investigators noticed that Josiah's wounds were far worse than anyone else's. His head struck dozens of times. Whoever killed him had something personal against him. Another strange detail was the lamp found at the foot of the parents' bed. Its chimney was removed, and the wick bent as though the flame had been turned down low, giving off only a dim light. It suggested the killer wanted just enough visibility to see his victims, but not enough for anyone outside to notice the glow through the windows. And then the axe. It belonged to Josiah Moore himself. After the murders, the killer had wiped it down and left it leaning against the wall. Investigators pieced together a theory. The killer likely entered through the back door, which had been left unlocked. He may have hidden in the attic or the barn until everyone went to sleep. Then, moving silently, he started with Josiah and Sarah upstairs, before killing the children one by one. Finally, he descended the stairs to the Stillinger girls. But why? That was the question haunting Villisca. Why would anyone butcher an entire family and 2 innocent guests in the dead of night? Some said it had to be a drifter, a random madman passing through town. Others whispered it was someone local, someone who knew the Moores, who bore a grudge, who had planned this carefully. Theories multiplied, suspicion spread, and before long Villisca was torn apart by paranoia. One name that kept coming up was Reverend George Kelly. He was a peculiar figure, an itinerant preacher from England, small and frail, with a strange demeanor that unsettled many. He had been at the Children's Day service the night before, and was seen watching the Moore family. Later, on a train out of Villisca, he allegedly told fellow passengers that 8 people had been murdered in town. even before the crime was publicly known. Kelly confessed once, then recanted, then confessed again years later. He described the killings in detail, but his stories were inconsistent, and many believed he was mentally unstable. Some thought he was seeking attention more than telling the truth. Another suspect was Frank F. Jones, a wealthy businessman in Villisca. He and Josiah Moore had bad blood. Josiah had once worked for Jones's hardware store before leaving to open his own. Worse, Josiah reportedly had an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. Motive? Absolutely. Opportunity? Perhaps. But Jones was a prominent figure, and though many suspected him, there was never enough evidence to bring him to trial. And then there was the traveling serial killer theory. Around that same period, similar axe murders occurred across the Midwest. Entire families slain in their homes at night, doors unlocked, victims bludgeoned in bed. Some investigators linked the Villisca case to a man named Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the family, who had committed axe murders in other states. But again, nothing was proven. The case went cold. Trials came and went. Suspects confessed, then withdrew, but no one was ever convicted. As years passed, the legend of Villisca grew darker. The Moore house became a place of fear and fascination. Children dared each other to run past it. Locals avoided it after sunset. Stories spread that strange sounds came from inside. Footsteps, whispers, the cries of children. By the late 20th century, the house was restored as a historic site. Paranormal investigators flocked to it, claiming to record voices and apparitions. Overnight visitors reported doors opening by themselves, shadows moving, cold spots in the air. Some swore they heard the sounds of children crying from the upstairs bedrooms. Skeptics dismissed it as imagination, fueled by the horror of the murders. But believers insisted the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters never left, that their spirits remained trapped in the house, replaying their final night. To this day, the Villisca Axe Murder House stands as one of the most infamous crime scenes in America. A century later, it still raises the same questions. Who could commit such a massacre? Why cover the mirrors? Why linger in the house afterward? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, was the killer someone the Moores knew? Someone they trusted? Villisca never healed. Families locked their doors after that night. Strangers were viewed with suspicion, and the town's name became forever tied to an unsolved horror. Because sometimes evil doesn't come from far away. Sometimes it lives right next door. By the time noon arrived on June 10, 1912, Villisca was no longer a quiet farming town. It had become a crime scene swarmed with rumors, journalists and fear. The Moore home sat like a dark heart in the middle of it all. Reporters from Des Moines, Omaha, even Chicago descended on the town. They scribbled notes, snapped photos, and turned the Moore tragedy into front-page headlines. Within days, Villisca's name was known across the country, and with the spotlight came suspicion, theories, and finger-pointing. Theories about the killer's movements filled the air. Some neighbors swore they had heard sounds in the night, footsteps, maybe whispers, but dismissed them at the time. Others insisted they saw a shadow moving in the yard. One farmer said his dog barked furiously around midnight, then suddenly stopped, as if silenced by something or someone. Investigators tried to trace the killer's path. At the edge of town, they found a strange discovery: a bowl of water with blood in it, and a plate of uneaten food, abandoned at the table. It looked as though the killer had washed his hands before leaving. That single detail shocked the town more than anything else. The thought that the murderer hadn't rushed away, but instead lingered, eating, cleaning, maybe even sitting in silence while 8 bodies lay inside the house. It was beyond comprehension. That act suggested calmness, patience, control, not the rage of a random drifter, but someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And then there was the locked front door. Whoever left that house had walked out calmly, securing the door behind them. As police struggled with the case, The townsfolk began looking at each other differently. Suspicion poisoned friendships. Neighbors who had known each other for years now cast wary glances, whispering that maybe the killer lived among them. Maybe he had even attended the funeral. And funerals they were. On June 12th, thousands of people gathered in Villisca for the joint service. 8 coffins were lined up, small and large, each draped in flowers. The sight broke the community. Children wept. Adults stared in silence, trying to comprehend how such evil had landed in their peaceful town. The Moore family was buried together. The Stillinger sisters were laid to rest nearby. For Villisca, the graves became symbols of grief and reminders of justice denied. But justice didn't come. Instead, the case grew stranger. Reverend George Kelly, the odd preacher, became the focus of gossip. Witnesses said he had an obsession with the case. He returned to Villisca repeatedly, asking townsfolk graphic questions about the murders. He even wrote letters to authorities offering his insight. When investigators looked deeper, they found that Kelly had a history of mental illness, voyeurism, and disturbing behavior. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested and charged. During interrogation, he confessed. He described the killings with shocking detail, saying God had whispered to him to slay the children. But days later, he withdrew the confession, claiming he had been coerced. At trial, his lawyers painted him as delusional but harmless, a man who wanted attention more than anything else. The jury acquitted him. Kelly walked free, and the case slipped back into limbo. Attention then turned to Josiah Moore's old employer, Frank Jones. Jones had been wealthy, respected, but deeply bitter over Josiah leaving his business. The alleged affair between Josiah and Jones's daughter-in-law gave the story even more fuel. Some investigators believed Jones had hired someone, a hitman perhaps, to kill Josiah, and that the slaughter of the whole family had been to eliminate witnesses. But no evidence ever surfaced, and Jones remained untouchable. And yet something even more disturbing emerged. Across the Midwest, between 1911 and 1914, eerily similar murders were reported. Entire families killed in their homes at night. The weapon, almost always an axe. The method, bludgeoning as they slept. Windows covered, lamps dimmed. The parallels were chilling. Some criminologists believed the Villisca murders were part of this wave, committed by a single serial killer who rode the railroads from town to town. One suspect, Henry Lee Moore, was convicted of murdering his mother and grandmother with an axe in 1912. Authorities tried to link him to Villisca, but again nothing was proven. Theories piled higher and higher, but answers, none. Over time, Villisca became defined by its mystery. Tourists passed through to see the murder house. Locals hated the attention but couldn't stop it. The story was too shocking, too unresolved. By the 1990s, the Moore home was restored to its 1912 condition. No electricity, no plumbing, just as it was that fateful night. And then came the ghost hunters. Paranormal groups swore the house was haunted. EVPs captured voices of children. Doors opened on their own. Some claimed they were scratched, pushed or overcome by nausea while inside. Skeptics said it was all imagination, that the power of suggestion made people experience what they wanted to believe. But even skeptics admitted the house carried a heavy atmosphere. Something about it felt wrong. And so Villisca lives on as both history and legend. Part true crime, part ghost story, part small-town tragedy, part national mystery. 8 people killed, one night, one axe, no answers, no closure, and maybe no peace. The years after 1912 did little to quiet the whispers in Villisca. The town carried the weight of suspicion like a permanent shadow. People locked their doors for the first time in living memory. Children were no longer allowed to play outside after dark. Farmers walking home from late shifts looked over their shoulders, convinced the killer still lurked somewhere close. Rumors began to spread about strange men riding the trains at night.
Railroad workers said they sometimes spotted drifters who carried axes with them, their faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats. One engineer recalled stopping his train near Villisca only weeks before the murders, and seeing a figure slip off the boxcars into the trees. The man vanished into the woods, carrying nothing but an axe. That story took root in Villisca, and many believed the town had been marked by a traveling killer. But then came the counterpoint. If the murderer had been a stranger, why had the attack felt so deliberate? Why had every lamp been dimmed, every mirror covered, and every body struck with such brutal precision? Some argued it had to be someone who knew the Morse, someone who carried not only an axe but also a personal vendetta. The split in theories divided the town. On one side, those who feared a faceless drifter. On the other, those who believed a neighbor, someone they waved to daily, was responsible. Both ideas were terrifying. Meanwhile, law enforcement blundered. The initial investigation had been sloppy at best. Curious onlookers had trampled through the Moore house before the crime scene was secured. Fingerprints were smudged. Evidence was handled without gloves. One visitor even took a fragment of Josiah Moore's skull as a souvenir. By the time serious investigators arrived, the trail was already cold. The case dragged on. Leads emerged, then evaporated. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Confessions popped up, only to collapse under scrutiny. By 1916, 4 years later, the official investigation had run in circles so many times that the townsfolk no longer believed justice would come. But the fear remained. Some claimed the Moore home itself had changed. Neighbors said it seemed darker, colder. Visitors often left unsettled. Farmers crossing the street at night avoided looking at the windows, afraid they might see movement inside. Even the children whispered about it at school, daring each other to run up to the porch and touch the front door before sprinting away. The house became more than a crime scene. It became a legend. And yet for those who studied the case, the evidence only grew stranger. The bowl of bloody water left in the kitchen, the untouched plate of food, the lamp carefully placed at the foot of the bed, the piece of raw bacon left beside the Stillinger sisters. These details didn't just suggest murder, they suggested ritual. But whose ritual? And why Villisca? Some pointed to Reverend Kelly again. He was eccentric, unstable, and obsessed with the murders. But others said Kelly was too frail, too small to swing an axe with such force. The killings required power, precision, and silence. Could a man like him really have pulled it off? Others pointed to Frank Jones. He had money, influence, and enemies. Some believed he had arranged the killing not with his own hands but through hired men. But Jones denied it until his death, and no proof ever surfaced. And then there was the possibility, almost too chilling to admit, that the killer never stopped. From 1911 to 1914, families across Illinois, Kansas, and Colorado were found murdered in eerily similar ways. The same weapon, the same staging, the same destruction of entire households. Police forces from different states rarely coordinated in those days. But looking back, criminologists saw a pattern, a shadow moving along the railroads, leaving trails of blood in quiet towns. If that theory was true, Villisca was just one stop in a nightmare journey. But for Villisca, the scars were permanent. The Moore family, once a symbol of success and faith, had been reduced to memory. The Stillinger girls, innocent visitors, became tragic footnotes, and the town itself, once a thriving community, became defined by a single word: murder. By the time the 1920s arrived, the case had faded from the headlines, but not from the town's identity. Parents used the story to warn their children. Travelers passed through just to see the house where it had happened. Villisca could never shake the past, and the past refused to stay buried. Decades later, in the 1990s, the house was restored to its original 1912 condition. The wallpaper, the furniture, even the lamps, everything returned to how it was that terrible night. People who stepped inside said it felt like walking into a trap, as if time had frozen, as if the air still carried the screams that had been silenced. Paranormal investigators flocked to the house. They claimed to hear footsteps in the empty halls, whispers of children's voices in the night, tools drained of batteries, cold spots where none should exist. Some visitors fled in terror, refusing to return. Others swore the house was one of the most haunted places in America. The skeptics laughed, but even they admitted something about Villisca was different, something unsettling, something unfinished. And so over a century later, the Villisca Axe Murders remain unsolved. Theories still swirl. Was it Kelly? Was it Jones? Was it a faceless drifter who vanished into the rails? No one can say for sure. What remains is the echo, the story of 8 people who went to sleep one summer night and never woke up. A story of a small town forever changed. A story that refuses to fade, because deep down everyone knows, whoever killed the Moore family walked away, free, untouched, unpunished. And maybe, just maybe, he smiled as he locked the door behind him. Time passed, but the mystery never loosened its grip on Villisca. By the mid-1920s, new generations of children were growing up under the shadow of the murders. For them the story wasn't just history, it was a warning. Parents would tell their children, don't stay out late, don't talk to strangers, and always check the locks. In Villisca, fear became part of daily life. But behind the fear there was obsession. People outside Villisca had started to take notice. Journalists wrote articles. True crime enthusiasts, though the term didn't exist yet, collected newspaper clippings and argued theories by mail. Each clue became fuel for endless speculation. Who could walk into a house full of people, slaughter them one by one, and then vanish without a trace? Investigators revisited the case again and again. They re-examined suspects. They interrogated witnesses, who had grown older but not necessarily wiser. Yet each time the case slipped away like smoke. Some pointed again to Reverend George Kelly, the strange traveling minister. His confession years earlier had been thrown out as unreliable, but many couldn't shake the thought, wasn't he just the kind of unstable man who might commit such a crime? He had been seen watching the Moore home. He had written disturbing letters to women. He had even confessed, however briefly. Could it all be coincidence? Then there was Senator Frank Jones, Josiah Moore's former employer. The rivalry between the two men was well known. Josiah had left Jones' business years earlier, taking valuable clients with him. Rumors swirled that Jones had never forgiven the betrayal, but suspicion without evidence meant nothing, and Jones, with his political connections, remained untouchable. Still others whispered about strangers who had drifted into town, men who hopped off trains, worked a few days, and disappeared. There were so many drifters, so many nameless faces passing through. Could one of them have been the killer? If so, he might have carried his axe onto the next train and committed similar horrors elsewhere. Theories aside, the strangest part of the case remained the details inside the Moore house. Each clue was like a riddle. Why had the killer covered the victims' faces with cloth? Why had he covered the mirrors with sheets? Why leave a plate of uneaten food on the table? Why leave a slab of bacon near the Stillinger girls? The crime didn't feel random. It felt staged, ritualistic, intentional. Psychologists later speculated that the killer may have felt guilt. Covering the faces could have been a way of hiding from what he'd done. Covering the mirrors may have been to avoid seeing his own reflection. But those were only theories, and no theory could explain everything. As decades passed, the house itself became a kind of time capsule. It stood empty, then changed owners, then was finally restored in the 1990s to look exactly as it had on the night of the murders. That restoration transformed the case from a cold file into a living experience. People from all over the country traveled to Villisca to see the house. Some came for history, others came for the thrill, and many came for something darker, because they believed the house was haunted. Visitors reported hearing children's laughter upstairs when no one else was there. Some claimed to feel icy hands brushing against their arms. Others swore they saw shadows moving through the rooms. Paranormal investigators set up cameras, audio recorders, and electromagnetic detectors. The results were chilling: strange voices, unexplained knocks, objects moving on their own. The skeptics dismissed it as imagination, but even skeptics admitted something about the house felt wrong. The air was heavy, as if it remembered, and yet the legend of Villisca was more than just ghosts. It was the unsolved puzzle of human cruelty. 8 innocent people had died in their sleep. A killer had walked free, and over a century later, no one knew the truth. The house today is more than a tourist attraction. It is a monument to the unknown, a place where history, fear, and mystery blend together. Some who visit leave shaken, others leave with more questions than answers. But all leave with the same thought: what kind of man could do this? And perhaps the darker question: what if he was never just one man? What if Villisca was just a stop in a larger journey? What if the killer went on to strike again and again, slipping through the cracks of small-town America, leaving bodies behind in silence? That thought is what keeps Villisca alive in the minds of true crime lovers today, because unsolved mysteries don't fade. They grow, they echo, they demand answers that never come, and the Moore family, along with 2 innocent guests, remain frozen in time, forever victims of a crime too brutal to forget. Villisca became a word not just on a map, but in the vocabulary of terror. And as long as the house stands, the story will continue to be told. By the 1930s, the murders were already slipping from the headlines. Bigger stories took over: bank robberies, prohibition, the Great Depression. But in Villisca, the memory stayed raw. The house on that quiet street stood like a wound that refused to heal. Children would dare each other to run up and touch the porch. Some swore they heard whispers when they pressed their ears to the door. Others claimed to see faces in the upstairs windows when the house should have been empty. Parents tried to steer their children away, but curiosity was stronger than fear. Meanwhile, investigators and amateur detectives kept the case alive. Some believed the Villisca murders were part of a string of similar crimes. Between 1911 and 1914, across the Midwest, there had been a wave of axe murders. Families killed in their sleep, strangers suspected, but never caught. In places like Colorado Springs, Kansas, and Illinois, nearly identical murders occurred. Whole families bludgeoned with an axe, curtains drawn, food left uneaten, faces covered. Could it be the same killer, moving from town to town? Some criminologists called him the Axeman of the Midwest. They believed he hopped trains, choosing small towns where no one would notice a stranger. He would wait for nightfall, enter a home, and unleash horror before disappearing at dawn. If this theory was true, Villisca was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a killing spree stretching across states. But without evidence, it was speculation. And in that speculation, Villisca became legend. As decades passed, the Moore house grew old, paint peeled, floors creaked. Families lived there briefly, but none stayed for long. Some said it was just a drafty, uncomfortable house. Others said the energy inside was unbearable. Tenants would move in, only to flee within months.